Now, we know that the Japanese American community was heavily concentrated in the Pacific states, Washington, Oregon, and especially California. And most worked, as we know, in the field of agriculture, agribusiness. And moreover, let's remember that in contrast to the earlier Chinese immigrants, we see more family formation. In other words, the gender imbalance is not as skewed compared to the Chinese, and we even see picture brides coming. So you see, as we discussed in the previous video, generations form, the second generation, okay, the distinction between Issei and Nisei. All right, now, even before Pearl Harbor, which happened in 1941, December 7th, even for, let's say, 2, 3 years before Pearl Harbor, there was this mounting tension between the United States and Japan. Japan was expanding as an empire. They were waging war and colonizing areas throughout the Pacific. As we know from previous lectures, that the United States looked at the Pacific as a place where they could exert their influence over. The technical term for this is sphere of influence, a sphere of influence. So obviously you have a conflict of interest, to put it mildly, between the United States and its designs upon the Pacific compared to Japan, who is now expansionist throughout the Pacific. And this is going to lead inexorably to World War II. In any case, there is this mounting tension because of Japanese expansionism colliding with American expansionism in the Pacific. And the Nisei, the second generation, had long dreaded a Japanese-American war. You know, they're American, really. They're born here. They, think of themselves as American, most of them. Yet they also have some cultural traits that are traceable to, let's say, tradition in Japan, like piety towards one's parents, right? Filial obedience and filial piety. Filial means parental, right? Um, they dreaded the fact that should war break out, well, they even had intuitions that they're going to be imprisoned and even executed. In fact, here is a quote that I have you that was actually in the late 1930s from a young Nisei who was even contemplating this idea of war. And he wrote this in his diary. He said, quote, "What are we going to do if war does break out between the United States and Japan? Well, in common language, we can say that we are sunk. Even if the Nisei wanted to fight for America, what are the chances? Not a chance. Our properties would be confiscated, and most likely we'd be herded into prison camps. Perhaps we would be slaughtered on the spot." Unquote. So there we go. We have some anxiety, um, and even some foreboding of what's going to happen in the future should the United States enter war with Japan due to escalating tensions. And then, of course, we have the attack on Pearl Harbor. That surprise attack on, again, December 7th, 1941. And in the words of FDR, this is a day that will live in infamy, quote unquote. And I should mention this when you think about this attack, this was a terrible attack, of course. And you had loss of American lives, and the military aggression of Japan is indefensible. But you also have to think about this, that was Pearl Harbor technically American soil? The answer is no, it's a colony. Okay, it was not a state in 1941. Hawaii would become a state in 1950. Okay, part of the 50 states, but before that, it was a colony. So, in a way, the reason why I'm addressing this is because Japan is getting colonies too, right? In the Pacific, as I mentioned, the United States already has colonies, the Philippines and Hawaii included among them. So what you're talking about is a colonial conflict here. That is to say, a conflict between two empires, two imperial formations in the Pacific region. Okay, so that puts it in perspective that you have two powers in the Pacific that are colliding, as I previously mentioned. But nonetheless, you see Pearl Harbor happening by December 7th, 1941. And right after that, you see this situation, this condition of hysteria, understandably so. In fact, if you know anything about 9/11, there's a similar event happened where we had hysteria and a sense of siege psychology that another terrorist attack was bound to happen, just inevitably after 9/11. Well, similarly, you see this after Pearl Harbor. You see this siege psychology envelop the country, especially if on the West Coast, because obviously that's the Pacific region. Okay, so hysteria sets in, and you have this fear again of a Japanese invasion happening on American shores. You have fear of another air raid attack similar to Pearl Harbor, perhaps in other parts of the United States, like let's say Los Angeles, San Diego, what have you. And as I mentioned, you have this fear of the Japanese within the United States, Japanese Americans, this fear of them committing acts of domestic sabotage, espionage, assisting Japanese invaders when they come, right? So again, this is the notion of fifth column. Fifth columnism refers to internal sabotage and internal subversion. Now, right away, the United States needed to take unprecedented measures against what they perceived was an imminent attack, something that's bound to happen after Pearl Harbor, right? Even though it proved to be non-existent, a non-existent threat. In hindsight, we realize that. But putting that aside, they had to consider measures to prevent not only another attack on American soil, well, on the states, that is, on the West Coast, but even this notion of the Japanese Americans in the West Coast committing fifth column activity. Now, how realistic was the belief that a West Coast attack would be aided and abetted by the Japanese Americans? Okay, basically, I'm asking this: how realistic was it that the Japanese would form a fifth column? Well, you did have some intelligence conducted by the U.S. military and the government. And by the way, this was even conducted before Pearl Harbor, because as I mentioned, it seemed that war was almost inevitable. So you see preliminary investigations into this matter, again, undertaken by military intelligence. And in their investigation, in trying to figure out where the allegiance of Japanese Americans lay, they discovered that they were not allegiant to Japan, okay, for the most part. Nothing substantive, in other words, in terms of possible fifth column activity, was concluded by military intelligence agents and officers. In fact, there was one particular naval intelligence officer who concluded that, quote, better than 90% of the Nisei and 75% of the original immigrants, that is to say, Issei, right, were completely loyal to the U.S. 90% of the Nisei, 75% of the Issei. Okay, that's what his conclusion was. Now, another intelligence officer actually broke into the Japanese consulate in San Francisco. And what he discovered in his investigation was that the Japanese government itself did not trust Japanese Americans. Okay, the Japanese government mistrusted both the Issei and the Nisei. They considered themselves as the Issei Nisei, as cultural traitors, and that they couldn't be depended upon. They couldn't be trusted to show allegiance and loyalty to the Japanese Empire. Okay, so there you go. Even though the Japanese Americans proclaimed to be, loyal and to have allegiance towards the United States after Pearl Harbor, and even before Pearl Harbor, as we mentioned, well, still, the United States did not trust them, but nor did the Japanese government trust them. So, in a way, they're caught in between this limbo, right, of not being trusted by both governments. And how do you situate yourself as a Japanese American if you find yourself in, this in between state? Now, with the shock and rage that followed on the heels of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Americans indeed found themselves lumped into this single category, that is to say, just Japanese. Whether or not they were American, that didn't matter. They were just Japanese. And the Japanese were now an enemy race. That is true, and that's justifiable. But what about Japanese Americans? Are they the enemy race? Well, this was the conclusion held by many, by most, certainly not all, okay, but the majority of Americans and certainly government officials felt that, yes, the Japanese Americans should be treated with suspicion at the very least. At the most, they should be rounded up and put into concentration camps. This is regardless of generation, regardless of citizenship, regardless of the loyalty, surveys that were conducted, regardless of age, regardless of gender, anything. They were all the same in the eyes of most Americans. They were all seen as suspicious and even treacherous, and they needed to be watched closely with a close eye. So the first regulation that discriminated against Japanese was passed the very next day after Pearl Harbor on December 8th, where you see the Department of Justice close the borders to all persons of Japanese descent, whether they're aliens or citizens. And then, during the rest of the month of December 1941, you see leaders of the Japanese community, such as teachers, Shinto priests. Shinto is a ancient religion in Japan. But you did have some Shinto practitioners among the Japanese Americans. Well, the priests were whisked away. Some Japanese American newspaper editors, so on and so forth, community leaders in the Japanese American community. They were arrested without warrant, and they were taken to places determined by the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Services, which is still with us today as an agency. Okay. In fact, the Attorney General, who was at that time appointed by FDR, of course, Francis Biddle, he basically mandated the search of Japanese households without the necessity of search warrants. So therefore, right away, you see the suspension of the Fourth Amendment rights. Okay, so this is happening right after Pearl Harbor. And then the next 1 or 2 months, you see the military, the Department of Justice, the FBI, and even leading political figures, the media and the press. They're all playing a role in this escalation and heightening of hysteria and paranoia. And a lot of it is targeted towards the Japanese as being, again, traitors to the United States, as, again, constituting a fifth column. Now, I should mention this, that when I say the media and the press, there was a lot of false reporting in some newspapers and the media at the time that supposedly, reportings of, Japanese subs, or Japanese patrol planes scoping out the West Coast. Now, there was one true account of a Japanese submarine on the West Coast that was actually found to be true, but the the majority of the reporting turned out to be false. And in fact, one false report that I recall is that of some of the pilots shot down during Pearl Harbor. The pilots, when they recovered the bodies of the Japanese, they found um, supposedly UCLA and UC Berkeley class rings on their fingers. Okay, now this was false as determined later, but what does that do? It heightens that hysteria and the sense of siege that is going to suffuse the entire nation, especially for those residents on the West Coast. Okay. Now, let's return to the political problem here. How can you justify the suspension, the abrogation of constitutional rights for an entire population of people, that is, Japanese Americans? How can you do this? And as we mentioned, there's going to be 120,000 people in prison. How can you get away with suspending the rights guaranteed by laws and by the Constitution itself for a large, very large number of people? How can you imprison them as soon as possible without trial, right? And by the way, you may have heard of the term habeas corpus, right? Habeus, and then corpus, corpus. That's a Latin term. And basically, it means right to a trial, to a procedure, before you're, accused of a crime, right? Due process is another term for this, right? Your right of due process. But clearly, there's no trial. There's no jury provided for the internment of Japanese. They're basically deemed to be guilty before proven innocent, guilty of being potential fifth column agents. Now, this is clearly anti American as you could get, right? But it was deemed to be a necessity by, again, our political leaders, especially with all the paranoia and sense of suspiciousness that was, again, enveloping the nation. Now we go to this term that I discuss here, or I list here on keywords, the politics of incarceration. Okay, and this deals with what I just mentioned. In order to justify this unprecedented act of suspending the constitutional rights of a large population of people, right? We see the U.S. government, we see national leaders, we see the media steer public opinion into believing the Japanese American populations that they are indeed a fifth column, and therefore the unavoidable course of action was internment. Okay, so um, let me just kind of explain that further. The politics of incarceration is this. Clearly, there's a political issue here when you want to or desire to incarcerate entire population, 120,000, without trial, suspending their rights, right? How are you going to do that in the United States when, they're all guaranteed by the Constitution, which is our secular Bible, right? How are we as a nation supposed to get away with this? Okay, so that contradiction, that dilemma is what exactly refers to as the politics of incarceration. Politics, of course, meaning things like, the political issue of constitutional rights. Okay, so the way it was done, as I just mentioned, was for this tidal wave of hysteria and justifications emitted by national leaders, political leaders, even leading journalists, at the time, who are saying, yes, this has to be done. People like Walter Lippmann, probably haven't heard of him, but he was the most influential newspaper columnist in in U.S. history at this time, right? He wrote a column called "The Fifth Column on the Coast," where he says, "quote: The West Coast is in imminent danger of a combined attack, both from without and within." And when you hear the term "within," that means Japanese Americans within the United States. You also had another well-respected, well-known journalist at the time named Edward Murrow, Murrow, who publicly announced his belief that the planes that would bomb the West Coast, that he felt was bound to happen, they would be piloted by Japanese Americans. Why? Because they had the geographical familiarity of the surroundings on the West Coast. Okay, so here are people speculating on what's going to happen, but they're saying it's inevitable. Now, obviously, the political issue is going to be overridden. That is to say, you're going to find justification for overcoming the dilemma of, let's say, the constitutional rights that are going to be caused with national leaders and journalists and all kinds of figures in the United States basically saying this is what should be done. Okay, incarceration. So that refers to the politics of incarceration. Again, the dilemma between constitutional rights and the actual act of incarceration, which had to overcome constitutional rights. That is the politics of incarceration.